I'm Matt.
I'm Kerry.
We are the Stagmer brothers of Baltimore Knife and Sword. We're going to be building some of your favorite weapons, and some weapons that you've never seen before.
This is Man-at-Arms, Reforged.
Thank you to Transformers The Last Night for sponsoring today's episode. Now playing in cinemas everywhere, Transformers The Last Night takes you on a journey to discover secrets of the past. In the film, only one world will survive, theirs or ours. What will happen when our heroes become our enemies?
Now, it wouldn't be a Transformers movie without them keeping everything under lock and key. But we can't tell you that Optimus Prime is no longer the noble hero that Earth has come to rely on. At 18 feet, Optimus Prime Sword is one of the largest in any film or comic. For obvious reasons, we couldn't create it quite to scale, but we felt it would be pretty cool to see a larger than human-sized version. Looks like it has a center seam, so we're going to forge 2 blade sections. We're also going to forge a tang, do a lot of tricky machining and a whole lot of detail, and by the end, this is going to be the most elaborate and largest thing we've ever made on the show.
To make one half of the functional blade, I'm going to take a piece of goodly tool steel, such as this, and forge it out on the power hammer. After I'm done with one half, I'm going to use it as a template to make the second. After the blades are forged, they're going to be ground and milled so that they can be attached to each other and to the rest of the sword.
Now, usually with these large, giant swords, it's just the size that really makes it complicated. But with this, it's got so much detail. You can see here the pommel's made up 20 different pieces. The handle has 140 of these little scales all around it. But I'm gonna go ahead and find an image that works best to draw our guard first, and then work from there. There's the base of our guard. We're gonna have to cut these pieces out separately. Out. I'm gonna make this blue piece a little longer because it's gonna end up tucking under this top piece. We're gonna cut these flat and then we're gonna bend them around to this shape. So obviously I have my hands full, a ton of drawing to still do, but I have some of the parts already figured out. I'm gonna hand them off to the guys down at the shop, we'll get them cut, and begin the forming. After stretching his round stock out to his desired length, Ilya can start using a series of tools to create the offset at both the point and the ricasso area. Once he has these offsets forged in, he can then lengthen it to where he needs and begin beveling the blade.
So Matt's passed me a thumb drive. It has a whole bunch of small drawings for all the different overlays and sections for this blade and for the guard. I'm going to go ahead and just start cutting these in the thickness that he needs. Most of them are in 10 gauge steel. I'll cut them with the plasma. Then he and Ilya will take them, form them, fit them into the pieces, and they'll get welded or screwed in place.
As he adds bevels to our blades, they will naturally curve, so he has to straighten them out as he goes. Ilya's completed forging both halves of our blade. Now, when I say halves, these will only make up about 2/3 of the length of this sword. This blade is going to be huge, probably the biggest one we've ever attempted on the show. He did a really good job forging them just about exactly the same. You can see this one just has a little more length to it. I'm going to start there and just grind off this point, true them up. I'm actually going to be doing 2 different kinds of hollow grinds. I'm going to do a 14-inch wheel up here on the big point section and a 12-inch along the length. So right now I'm going to start with the 12-inch. I'm going to hog off as much material as I can here. While I'm grinding on the second blade, I'm going to go ahead and hand off the first one to Bill. He's going to help me transform that 12-inch hollow into a 14 near the tip.
So we have the 2 blades now. We have the rough forgings. They've been roughly ground. Ilya went over them to soften them a little bit in the forge. I'm going to be cutting biscuit joints. We're cutting these slots here where we're going to create a piece of chromoly that slides into that. It's going to allow us to fasten the blades so that they can't move like this and they stay as one piece. I'm going to be using a 3-flute center cutting end mill. It'll give us 2 locations here and here where the blades won't be able to move at all.
When working on super complex items such as this sword, and in particular the handle, you first have to break everything down into its most simple parts in order to succeed. Otherwise, you'll just be too overwhelmed and you won't get anywhere. First thing I have to do is cut out 165 of these scales that'll be welded onto the handle, and then we'll move from there. Now that we have all the scales cut, John's going to remove some of the dross that happens naturally from the plasma cut, and then we'll be able to weld everything together.
I'm about to forge out the tang for Optimus Prime Sword. I'm still using our tool steel. However, the tang is going to be double-sided, so essentially it's 2 tangs facing the opposite directions. The side that goes into the handle is pretty standard. However, the longer part of the tang goes between the blades and serves as the armature, holding all the pieces together and providing a solid construction, much like you see in architecture. The way I calculate the length of the tang is by using a compass and a printed out image of the sword. If I know from the forging the tip is 17 inches, I can take a compass and superimpose that length onto the rest of the sword, producing a 59-inch tang from tip to tip.
Ilya now begins to lay out all the sections of this blade. It'll give us a much better idea of where we need to go and what forms need to be made so that they can match up before assembly.
To attach the scales to the handle, we're going to weld them on. We weld the first scale, overlap the weld with the second scale, and continue that process for all 150 scales. In between each section of scales, we have to weld on some 1/4 x 1/4 square bars. After they're attached, I'll grind some flats on them, and that'll give us the exact look that we're shooting for.
I'm about to make some overlays for the blade. Now, this is my test piece, which turned out pretty nice, so I'm going to use it. However, The sword has two sides and I have to continue making these overlays for the second. With a blade this heavy, I have to use as much sheet metal as I can to distribute the weight away from the tip towards the guard. To strike the initial line, I'm going to use this tool right here. This will create a small crease which I can later on follow with the hand hammering and bend the edge over. Now that the rough shape is basically done, it's time to mark all the decoration and the fluting. It's way easier, instead of measuring everything out all over again, just to use the existing piece and track the beginning points of the flutes onto the next piece. To strike all these lines, I'm going to use a tool that is very similar to the one I used before, but much smaller and more radiused. That way I have deeper penetration into the sheet metal.
With our handlebars now attached, I'm going to move to the sander and add flats to each one of them to mimic the look from the movie.
Even though these blades have been forged in 1045, which you often see us take in water for heat treating, Ilya is going to be using oil for these because we need these pieces to stay true as possible so that the warp does not affect how they fit together. Now that we've allowed the oil to come back to room temperature, Ilya can quench the second blade.
After the sheet metal overlays are formed, it's time to do the cutouts. Now, since the pieces are formed, it is very hard to set them up on the automatic CNC plasma because of the level changes, and the plasma doesn't do very well against a three-dimensional object. So the good old trusty tool using hands and eyes would suffice. As you can see, this is pretty rough. That's the consequence of doing it by hand. However, I cut it smaller than it needs to be, so all I have to do is retrace my objective goal and go in with a slack belt on the 24 grit and cut all the rag, all the burrs off, and form it exactly how they're supposed to be.
Alright, now that our blades have been heat treated, tempered, and most importantly, straightened, I can go in and hog a lot more material off. Refine these edges that I left really blunt to play it safe for the heat treat into sharp edges. So I'm gonna go back to the 12-inch wheel once again, 24 grit, and just hog a lot more material off.
once the pieces are cut out, it's time to shape them. To that end, I use a oxypropane torch and one of my standard stakes. I heat up localized areas and use a set of hammers to push them in and out of the curve, producing a three-dimensional shape.
Alright, we got our blades through 80 grit. I'm gonna jump from 80 to a 280. Usually I would do a 120 in between there, but when hollow grinding, as long as you have sharp belts, that's fine. Now you hear us talk about numbers on grits a lot of different times. What that means is how many sharp particles are within a square inch. So on a 24 grit belt, there's only 24 granules, making it really rough. On a 280 like this, there's 280 within that same square inch, giving you a much finer, smoother finish.
Some of these parts have more form than others. Ilya is now going to be forming the section that we're calling the mask because of its general shape. It's made out of 10 gauge sheet metal, and he's got to work some of this hot and weld up some edges before he blends it out.
Alright, all the polishing on this blade is now complete. My very last step is to Scotch-Brite it and then add a secondary bevel. Normally you see a Scotch-Brite on the hard wheel outside, but in this case we're going to do something a little different. We put a Scotch-Brite belt on our actual sanders. That way I don't have to change radiuses. I can stay with my 14-inch radius, keep all my hollow grind exactly true, and polish it out. My very last thing I'm going to do after that is move to the 80 grit over here and put our secondary bevel, aka our sharp edge. When I first looked at the design for the guard, I thought we could just plasma cut it out. But upon further review, it's much too thick for our plasma cutter. So Ilya's gonna start from a large, round stock piece of iron, forge it out, punch a hole, and we'll move on from there. When punching a hole in material this thick, there are many, many challenges. Your tool can get stuck, and if your hole gets off just by a little bit, it's gonna really show in the end and we'll have to do a lot of cleanup work. So Ilya's gonna take his time, make sure it's right in the center, and get this hole punched. So Ilya has forged our giant crossguard and punched our center hole, which is really going to save me a lot of time in milling, so I don't have to worry about the slot at all. But what I do have to do is I have to mill in some steep angles on the ends. I got to turn this big blocky end into one that looks like this. Got to add taper on all the surfaces. So I'm going to use a 1-inch cutter on our vertical mill and just mill in those slot areas and move to the sander to clean everything up.
Normally we're just using chilled air to blow chips out of the way and to cool the area down around the cutter. In this case, he's using a very large cutter on a big piece of steel and generating a lot of heat. So Ilya comes in with a bottle of coolant and lightly goes over the surface as he makes the cut. Now that Matt's removed a lot of material using the mill, he's going to go to the grinders and continue to create his form and blend all the lines left from the milling cutters. Creating some of the detail in this case will require hammer and chisel. He's going to be driving in different sections. He'll come back and use the hammer to finally finish them out, and then Scotch-Brite to smooth out the surfaces. With all these different sections beginning to get confusing, Matt and Ilya lay them out on the floor so that we can see how all the connections will work. They've got to make sure that there's no additional pieces that need to be made or small tweaks that need to be done on the forming.
I'm at the point now where our guard fits to the handle. Got a few more pieces to make, but we've made a lot of progress, so let's take a look. This has changed a lot since you guys have seen it last. We've added some more detail here. This whole guard gets painted red. The other thing that I've been working on is the handle. There are over 500 pieces that go together to make this handle. I've made these pieces here that are in the actual drawing, but I'm gonna use them to actually lock onto the guard, like so. Then we made some central pieces. Just cut these out a ½ inch and then ground them to shape. There's one of those big overlay pieces that Ilya did. We'll then cover this. I've cut these little L-shaped langettes, you could call them. They're gonna be mounted on either side of the central bar. We'll go ahead and cut 4 of those out. Once Ilya gets all of the overlays, we'll be able to finalize the design. From here, we're basically just putting stuff together. One of the final steps to do on this giant sword blade is to engrave the runes. Ferenc is first going to draw them out with a Sharpie and then trace them over by hand using a Dremel tool. With most of the parts now painted red or blue, the next step is to distress them. They have to look like they've been in many battles. So Kerry's gonna use a scraper, scrape off some of the paint, and we're gonna use some tricky techniques afterwards as well. This build was not only the largest, but it was the most complex thing we've ever attempted to build on man-at-arms. Hundreds of pieces went into making this sword, and many long nights. I'm really proud of this one. Let's just see who can actually lift it.
Thank you to Transformers The Last Night for sponsoring this episode. See it today in cinemas everywhere.